How can we harness moral psychology to reduce meat consumption? Well, a number of philosophers have given moral arguments for vegetarianism, and they often involve two key premises. One is a moral premise, and the other is an empirical premise. The moral premise is something like supporting severe and unnecessary harm to animals is seriously wrong. That seems quite plausible. Then we add the empirical premise that eating meat from factory farms typically, at least for most of us, supports that kind of harm. And so we can conclude that eating meat from factory farms is typically seriously wrong. Now, if this is such a simple and compelling argument, why has it failed to motivate many people? Well, part of the problem might be weakness of will. Some people do buy into this sort of argument, but they just can't muster the strength to change their behavior. But we suggest that many consumers don't buy the argument in the first place. And we want to point out a number of psychological mechanisms that can help to explain this resistance, but also point towards a way forward. So there are these two mechanisms that seem to come up quite a bit in a number of different types of literature. One is motivated reasoning, and the other is what we'll call social proof. It's a kind of social learning. So first, see how these two mechanisms can play a role in doubting the moral premise. A number of studies show that when people are presented with moral arguments for vegetarianism, they're led to rationalize their meat consumption by increasing their speciesist attitudes. That's the degree to which they think human interests are more important than animal interests. And there's a similar effect of social proof. If most of the people around you that you trust in your community, your friends, family members, church members, all eat meat from factory farms, then that might be powerful social proof that it's natural and normal to allow this kind of severe harm to happen, to privilege human interests in this way. These two mechanisms can also play a role in doubting the empirical premise. So a number of studies suggest that when people are presented with moral arguments for vegetarianism, they will also be more likely to de-mentalize animals. So they'll tend to think that they can't suffer that much, including these factory farm animals. Social proof can have a similar kind of effect. If most of the people around you in your community all eat meat from factory farms, then any of the abuses that you might hear about or severe suffering on factory farms will seem like they must be rare or at least not that systematic. And all of this comes together to lead to rejection of this sort of argument, or at least enough doubt to not really fully buy it. But importantly, we think that these psychological mechanisms can be used to actually help reduce meat consumption. So think about motivated reasoning. There is some evidence that increasing awareness about mental capacities of animals and their conditions on factory farms can actually lead people to reduce their meat consumption or reduce their willingness to. And similarly, these moral arguments that point out inconsistencies in our reasoning do seem to have a small impact on people's dietary practices. But often that's not enough. We need the motivated reasoning to be motivated towards the interests of animals more than human interests. And for that, we think you'd have to increase empathy. And some studies do suggest that it helps to associate the meat that's on people's plates with the living beings that it came from on factory farms. But we would also suggest that building relationships with farmed animals can help to increase that empathy and motivate the reasoning towards rationalizing animal interests more so than human gustatory interests. Social proof can also have a positive effect on meat reduction. Some of this can come about through making one's meat reduction or veganism or vegetarianism more visible so others can see it. So there can be trendsetters or social influencers who can lead others to follow suit, as long as they're not doing it in a way that's off-putting, like virtue signaling or grandstanding. It can also help to publicize downward trends in meat consumption. Other people see that there's a trend and they will be more likely to follow it. We can also normalize meat reduction through institutional choices, things like having default vegetarian options for conferences, say for lunches, and also having meatless Mondays at schools, for example. So these are just some of the ways in which these two mechanisms from moral psychology can be harnessed to reduce meat consumption for moral reasons.